In 1980, a country signed a 20-year contract to build a coffee farm on the other side of the planet. It paid for the machinery, the trucks, the hydroelectric plant, the housing for 10,000 workers. In exchange, it was owed half of everything that farm produced, every year for 2 decades. That country was East Germany. It dissolved in 1989, 9 years into the deal, having barely collected on any of it. The farm it built is still there. So is the country it built it in. Today, that country is the second largest coffee producer on Earth, and almost nobody who drinks its coffee has ever heard how it got there. That's the story hiding behind your morning cup. Not just where coffee came from, but the wars, the borders, the collapsing empires, and one particularly determined civet cat that decided who gets to drink it and how. Let's dig in. The most repeated version of coffee's discovery involves a goat herder named Kaldi, some unusually energetic goats, and a monk who threw the berries into a fire before the smell changed his mind. It's a good story. It's also almost certainly not a true one. The earliest surviving written version of it doesn't appear until 1671 in a Latin treatise by a Maronite scholar named Antoine Faustus Nyron, more than 8 centuries after the events it describes supposedly took place. That's not how real history gets recorded. It's exactly how folklore gets recorded. A tidy explanation attached to something long after the fact, once nobody's left alive to contradict it. What's not disputed is the geography. Wild coffee, the species Coffea arabica, has grown for thousands of years in the highland forests of what's now southwestern Ethiopia, in the region historically called Kaffa, which may be where the plant's name comes from. Long before anyone brewed a hot drink from it, communities there were already using the plant, chewing the leaves, crushing the berries into a fat-based paste for a portable energy source on long treks. The stimulant effect wasn't a discovery so much as something people had known about for generations before it became a beverage at all. The shift from chewed paste to brewed drink happened across the Red Sea in Yemen. Coffee likely reached the Yemeni port of Mecca through trade sometime before the 15th century, carried by merchants moving along established Red Sea routes, rather than by any single dramatic act of discovery. Once it arrived, it found its first serious audience among Sufi religious communities, who used it deliberately, not recreationally, to stay alert through long nights of prayer and chanting, part of a devotional ritual known as Decaf. The Arabic name for it, kahwa, is the word from which coffee ultimately descends, and it originally referred to wine, which tells you something about how the drink was first understood. Not a morning habit, but something closer to a controlled substance with a specific devotional job to do. Yemen didn't just consume coffee, it monopolized it. Coffee became the region's first true cultivated export crop, grown on painstakingly built stone terraces cut into the mountainsides above towns like Sana'a and Mecca, watered by hand in a landscape with almost no natural rainfall to spare. Every bean that left the Arabian Peninsula for 2 centuries was boiled or partially roasted first, deliberately sterilized so no one outside Yemen could plant a living seed. That single logistical decision is the reason the entire next chapter of coffee's history becomes a story about theft. Coffee's spread out of Yemen wasn't one story, it was at least 3, and each one shows a different authority trying to control the same drink for a completely different reason. Mecca, 1511. Control through religious law. As coffee moved north into the Islamic world, it started gathering in a new kind of space, the coffee house, where men of different classes sat together to talk, gamble, and gossip in ways that made the people governing them nervous. In 1511, the governor of Mecca, Beg, convened a religious court and had coffee formally put on trial, arguing it was an intoxicant banned under Islamic law. The ban lasted about a year before a higher court in Cairo overturned it and Beg was removed from his post. It's a pattern that would repeat for the next century. An Ottoman authority bans coffee on moral grounds. Coffeehouse culture keeps existing anyway, and the ban eventually collapses, most dramatically under Sultan Murad IV in the 1630s, who reportedly walked Istanbul's streets in disguise, personally hunting down coffee drinkers. Prussia, 1777. Control through economic decree, enforced by men who could smell it on you. More than 2 centuries later, coffee ran into a very different kind of resistance, and this one had nothing to do with religion. Frederick the Great of Prussia didn't think coffee was sinful, he thought it was expensive. Prussia imported all of its coffee, and after the 7 Years' War left the royal treasury nearly empty. Frederick resented every thaler of it leaving the country. In a formal 1777 manifesto complaining that coffee had spread into every level of Prussian society and was draining money abroad, he declared flatly that his people should be drinking beer instead. His Majesty was brought up on beer, and so were his ancestors. Frederick didn't stop at rhetoric. He established a royal coffee roasting monopoly, banned private citizens and non-licensed roasters from roasting their own beans, and to actually enforce a ban on something that mostly happens behind closed doors, hired roughly 400 disabled war veterans and gave them a job with no modern equivalent, walking the streets of Prussian cities, sniffing the air for the smell of home-roasted coffee. They were nicknamed the Kaffeeschnüffler, the coffee sniffers, and if one of them caught a whiff coming from your house, he was entitled to search it, confiscate the beans, and collect a cut, by some accounts as much as a quarter of whatever fine got levied. It did not work. Smuggling exploded instead of shrinking. Ordinary Prussians resented armed veterans barging in over a beverage. Some households switched to roasted chicory root and grain-based substitutes just to have something hot and bitter without breaking the law. And within a decade of Frederick's death in 1786, his successor quietly abandoned the whole apparatus and let the coffeehouses reopen. Where Mecca tried to ban coffee outright on religious grounds, Prussia tried something more modern and, in its own way, more absurd. An entire state-funded surveillance program built around the human nose. The Ottoman World, 1974. Control through renaming. The most recent version of this fight isn't about banning coffee or taxing it. It's about who gets to claim it. Throughout the former Ottoman world, the same drink, finely ground beans, unfiltered, brought slowly to a near boil in a small, long-handled pot called a jezve, goes by a different name depending entirely on politics, not preparation. In Bosnia, it's Bosnian coffee. In Armenia, Armenian coffee. In Cyprus today, Cypriot coffee. And in Greece, for most of the 20th century, it was simply called Turkish coffee, the same as everywhere else. That changed after 1974, when Turkey invaded Cyprus. In the wave of anti-Turkish sentiment that followed, Greek speakers began deliberately dropping the name. According to Greek food historian Albert Aru, who remembers ordering Turkish coffee as a child in the 1960s, the switch to Greek coffee gathered momentum through the 1970s and 80s, competed for a while with newly fashionable iced frappe and imported espresso, and was cemented by television advertising in the 1990s. Nothing about the bean, the grind, or the pot changed, only the label did, and only because of a war that had nothing to do with coffee at all. For nearly 3 centuries, almost the entire coffee-drinking world depended on a single species, Arabica, descended from a genetically narrow pool of plants smuggled out of Yemen by the Dutch in 1616 and passed hand to hand through Amsterdam's greenhouses, the French royal gardens, and eventually the Caribbean and Brazil. That narrowness was a hidden vulnerability, and in the 1870s it caught up with the entire industry. A fungal disease called coffee leaf rust, Himalaya vastatrix, nicknamed Devastating Emily by the planters it ruined, tore through the coffee estates of Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka, which by 1870 was exporting well over £100 million of coffee a year, and stood among the British Empire's premier coffee colonies. There was no cure. Within 20 years, 90% of the island's coffee cultivation lay abandoned. Land prices collapsed, and some of the banking houses that had financed the plantations went under with them. A Scottish planter named James Taylor had already been experimenting, almost as an afterthought, with a 19-acre tea garden at the Luwak estate since 1867. Tea wasn't the plan. It was a hedge. When the rust finished what it started, that hedge became the entire economy. Ruined coffee planters tore out their dying trees and put in tea instead. And by 1888, the island had more acreage under tea than it had ever had under coffee. In 1890, a Glasgow grocer named Thomas Lipton arrived on what he'd intended as a stopover on the way to a holiday in Australia. Realized bankrupt coffee estates were selling for a fraction of their former value and bought several on the spot. Ceylon, the birthplace of one of the world's biggest coffee industries, became, within about 2 decades, one of the most famous tea-producing regions on Earth. And it happened because a fungus wiped out the crop that came before it. Coffee itself, meanwhile, needed a plant that wouldn't be so fragile. Not far from Arabica's original Ethiopian range, a different, hardier species had been growing largely unexploited. Coffea canephora, known today as Robusta. It tolerates heat and humidity Arabica can't handle, resists disease far better, and produces roughly double the caffeine content, though with a harsher, more bitter flavor that the industry had always treated as inferior. For decades, Robusta stayed a backup option, grown where Arabica wouldn't survive, and mostly used for cheap blends and instant coffee. It took another crisis, a century later and on the other side of the world, to turn Robusta from a footnote into a superpower. Not every chapter of coffee spread is about empires and trade routes. Some of it is about what happens when people are denied the thing they're growing. During the Dutch colonial period in 19th century Java, under a forced cultivation system that turned huge stretches of the island into coffee plantations, local farmers were explicitly forbidden from harvesting or keeping any of the beans they grew. The crop belonged entirely to the colonial administration, but nobody had banned picking up what an animal left behind. The Asian palm civet, a small, nocturnal, cat-like mammal locally called a Luwak, had a habit of eating the ripest coffee cherries in the plantations at night and passing the beans through its digestive system undigested. Javanese farmers, shut out of the crop they grew with their own hands, started collecting those beans from the forest floor, washing them and roasting them. What they found was that the civet's digestive enzymes broke down some of the bean's bitter proteins during the trip through its gut, producing a smoother, less acidic cup than anything they were legally allowed to drink. Word of the resulting coffee Kopi Luwak, eventually reached the Dutch themselves, who started demanding it as a novelty in its own right, turning something invented purely out of necessity into a luxury good. That would be a strange but fairly contained piece of colonial trivia, except that Kopi Luwak never stayed a folk curiosity. It resurfaced internationally in the early 1990s, introduced to Western buyers by a British coffee trader named Tony Wilde, who brought it into upscale retail and helped build much of its modern mystique. Demand for a genuinely rare forest-collected item ran far ahead of the actual supply wild civets could produce, and the industry's answer was captivity. Investigations by the BBC and by animal welfare groups, including PETA, have repeatedly documented civets, naturally solitary, wide-ranging animals, held instead in wire cages roughly a meter across, fed almost nothing but coffee cherries, in quantities equivalent to dozens of double espressos a day, and displaying the pacing, spinning, and cage-biting behaviors associated with severe captive stress. Much of this coffee is still sold labeled wild-sourced, despite farmers themselves telling investigators on camera that sourcing enough truly wild-collected beans to meet global demand is close to impossible, and that the mislabeling is common knowledge inside the industry, not an accident. Tony Wilde, the man who introduced Kopi Luwak to the West in the first place, has since spent years publicly campaigning for a boycott of the very product he helped make famous. A coffee that began as an act of quiet resistance against colonial deprivation is now, across much of its modern supply chain, built on a different kind of confinement entirely. If coffee rust cracked open an opportunity for Robusta, it was a country that no longer exists that turned that opportunity into an industry. By the mid-1970s, East Germany had a coffee problem it could not ignore. Coffee had become a genuine part of daily life across the Eastern Bloc, and the German Democratic Republic imported all of it, paying in scarce hard currency it could barely spare. Then, in 1975, a rare Antarctic cold front swept through Brazil, at the time responsible for a huge share of the world's coffee, and devastated that year's harvest. Global coffee prices spiked. East Germany's coffee import bill jumped roughly fivefold in a single year, from around 150 million valuta mark to nearly 700 million. The government briefly rationed coffee domestically and, in a move that generated real public anger, cut cheap coffee out of everyday products entirely for a period. A moment East Germans remembered afterward as the coffee crisis. Unable to depend on Brazil and unwilling to keep bleeding foreign currency, East Germany looked for a socialist ally who could grow coffee instead of sell it at market price. It found one in Vietnam, newly reunified after decades of war and in desperate need of its own reconstruction. Vietnam had grown some coffee under French colonial rule decades earlier, but nowhere near industrial scale. In 1980 and again in 1986, East Germany and Vietnam signed formal agreements. East Germany would supply machinery, trucks, an irrigation system, and a hydroelectric plant worth some $20 million, along with agricultural training in cultivating Robusta, the same hardy, disease-resistant, high-caffeine species that had emerged from the coffee rust crisis a century earlier. In exchange, Vietnam would deliver half its harvest to East Germany every year for the next 20 years. Together, the two countries built a joint operation named Café Combinat Viet Duc, which grew from 600 hectares in 1975 to nearly 9,000 by 1989, complete with new housing, schools and hospitals for the roughly 10,000 workers relocated to farm it. That relocation wasn't a footnote. The plantations were carved out of Vietnam's central highlands, land long inhabited by ethnic minority communities who had little say in how it was surveyed, redistributed, or replanted around them. Historians studying the project have since pointed out that the same mutual aid that rebuilt Vietnam's coffee sector also displaced indigenous highlanders and reshaped the region's biodiversity, clearing forest for monoculture on a scale the area had never seen before, with the benefits flowing mostly to the state and, for a while, to a country on the other side of the world that would barely get to enjoy them. East Germany never got its 20 years. The country that had financed the entire project dissolved in 1989, the same year the farm reached its full planted size, having collected only a fraction of what it was owed. But the infrastructure, the training, and the plantations stayed exactly where they were, centered on a highland city called Buon Ma Thuot, which today calls itself the coffee capital of Vietnam and produces a large share of the country's entire crop. Freed from Cold War trade restrictions and with a functioning Robusta industry already built, Vietnam kept expanding through the 1990s on its own terms, timing that happened to coincide with another seismic shift in the global coffee trade. In 1989, the same year East Germany ceased to exist, the decades-old International Coffee Agreement, the quota system that had propped up global coffee prices since the 1960s, collapsed after producing countries couldn't agree on how to divide shrinking export shares. Prices fell by roughly 40% almost overnight, and within 5 years, the benchmark price had dropped by nearly 3/4 from its 1989 level. For established, low-cost, high-volume growers, that collapse was an opening rather than a catastrophe, and Vietnam's newly built Robusta capacity, engineered, trained, and financed by a country that no longer existed to see it happen, was perfectly positioned to flood a market that had just lost its price floor. By the end of that decade, Vietnam had become the world's second-largest coffee producer, behind only Brazil. And today it remains the single largest Robusta grower on the planet, a position built brick by brick and hectare by hectare by a country that dissolved before it ever collected on the investment. The 1989 price collapse didn't just reward Vietnam's newly built Robusta capacity. It also produced a response, and the response has a strange literary connection, running straight back to Chapter 5's story about colonial Java. In 1988, a year before the International Coffee Agreement fell apart, a Dutch aid organization launched the world's first fair trade certification label for coffee. They named it Max Havelaar, after the title character of an 1860 Dutch novel. A colonial administrator in the Dutch East Indies who turns against his own government after witnessing how brutally Javanese farmers were exploited to keep coffee and other exports flowing to Amsterdam. It's the same colonial coffee system, run in the same Dutch colony that produced Kopi Luwak as an act of quiet resistance a century earlier. A movement built to fix modern coffee's price problem picked its name from a 128-year-old protest novel about the exact same underlying arrangement. Farmers growing a crop they had no real claim to the profits from. By 1997, the various national fair trade labels had merged into a single certifying body. And today, certified coffee carries a guaranteed minimum price, specifically designed to survive the kind of price crash 1989 caused. Whether that guarantee has actually closed the gap between what a cup costs in a cafe and what a farmer is paid for growing it remains one of the more genuinely contested questions in the entire modern industry. Critics on both sides argue it either barely moves the needle against a market this large, or that it's the only mechanism currently doing anything at all to protect the people at the bottom of it. Either way, it's a strange legacy for a 19th century Dutch novel to end up carrying into a 21st century supermarket aisle. While all of this was happening, smuggling, monopolies, sniffers, quota collapses, the place where coffee actually began kept doing something almost nobody outside Ethiopia paid much attention to. Drinking it the way it had been drunk for generations, unrushed and unindustrialized. The Ethiopian coffee ceremony, known locally as buna, is a daily household ritual, not a special occasion. It's traditionally led by the woman of the household, who roasts the green beans over an open flame in full view of the guests, grinds them by hand in a wooden mortar called a mukecha, and brews them in a long-necked clay pot called a jebena, often with frankincense burning nearby and fresh grass spread across the floor. A guest arriving for the ceremony is expected to bring a small gift, sugar or incense, and the coffee is traditionally offered first to the oldest person present, a small, repeated act of respect for age that has nothing to do with the drink itself and everything to do with who a household considers worth honoring first. The same grounds are used to brew 3 separate rounds of coffee, each weaker than the last, and each with its own name and its own meaning. Abo, the first and strongest round, meant to mark the start of the gathering, Tona, the second, and Baraka, the final and lightest round, whose name literally means blessing. Leaving before the third round is served is considered rude nearly everywhere in the country. The entire ceremony typically runs 1 to 2 hours, and the everyday Amharic phrase for it, buna tetu, drink coffee, has come to simply mean, let's sit down together. There's a real irony buried in that ritual. Ethiopia is the country whose coffee got fought over, banned, smuggled, monopolized, and eventually turned into a global industry worth hundreds of billions of dollars. And inside Ethiopia itself, none of that changed how the drink is actually served at home. The empires that grew rich exporting Ethiopian genetics never exported the way Ethiopians drink their own coffee, because that was never a commodity to begin with. It still isn't. Here's something that has nothing to do with empires or trade routes. In 1734, Johann Sebastian Bach, a man mostly known for writing solemn religious music for German churches, sat down and wrote a comic mini-opera about a young woman who is completely, unapologetically addicted to coffee. It's called Schweigt stille, plaudert nicht, though everyone just calls it the Coffee Cantata. The plot: a father, Herr Schlendrian, is furious that his daughter, Liesken, won't give up her 3 cups of coffee a day. He threatens to take away her new dresses. He threatens to stop her going out. Finally, he threatens to refuse her a husband entirely unless she quits. Liesken appears to cave, and then secretly writes a clause into her own marriage contract, guaranteeing her the right to keep drinking coffee anyway. At one point, she sings that if she's not allowed her coffee 3 times a day, she'll shrivel up like a piece of roast goat. Bach wrote the piece to be performed at Café Zimmermann, a real coffee house in Leipzig, where he led the city's amateur music ensemble. He was, by most accounts, something of a coffee enthusiast himself. The whole thing closes with a trio in which the narrator, the father, and the daughter all step out of the story to deliver the actual moral to the audience directly. Cats don't stop chasing mice, and daughters, mothers, and grandmothers alike aren't going to stop drinking their coffee. So parents may as well stop fighting it. which means one of the most serious composers in the history of Western music once wrote an entire comic operetta defending a young woman's right to drink as much coffee as she wanted, nearly 300 years before anyone's grandmother needed the same argument. Not every disputed origin story in coffee's history is about who discovered the plant. One of the strangest is about who discovered how to remove the thing that makes it coffee. In 1902, a German coffee merchant named Ludwig Woselius lost his father, and the attending physician told him the cause was years of excessive coffee consumption. Whether or not that diagnosis was medically sound by modern standards, Woselius took it seriously enough to spend years afterward trying to find a way to strip caffeine out of coffee beans without ruining the flavor. According to the story Woselius's own company told for decades, the breakthrough came by accident in 1903 when a shipment of green coffee beans crossing the sea to Germany was soaked through with seawater during a storm. When the batch arrived, the beans had lost much of their caffeine, and oddly, most of their flavor remained intact, aside from an unwelcome saltiness. Whether that shipwreck story is literally true or a piece of convenient corporate mythology built around a real accident is genuinely unclear. It has the same too perfect shape as a lot of origin legends in this history, and it comes to us entirely from Woselius's own account. What's not in dispute is what he did next. By 1906, he had patented an industrial process, steaming green beans in a saltwater brine, then washing them with a solvent to strip out the remaining caffeine. He sold the result under the brand Café HAG in Germany, and it eventually reached America, renamed Sanka. For decades, that process depended on one particular solvent, benzene. It worked. It was also, science eventually confirmed, carcinogenic, a fact nobody involved in 1906 had any way of knowing, and one that quietly forced the entire decaffeination industry to abandon Woselius's original method. The replacement took an uncomfortably long time to arrive. A chemical-free approach using nothing but water and an activated charcoal filter, eventually branded the Swiss water process, was first developed in Switzerland in 1933. But it took until 1980 for a Swiss company, Cofex, to make it commercially workable, and until 1988 for a Canadian company in Burnaby, British Columbia, to bring it to market at real scale. Coffee's first mass-market health product turned out, decades on, to carry a health risk of its own, and it took the better part of a century for the industry to fully replace it with something that didn't. If Kopi Luwak shows how far people will go to make ordinary coffee seem rare, the modern specialty coffee market has produced something stranger. A variety that was rare the entire time, and nobody noticed for decades. The variety is called geisha, or gesha, named for the region in southwestern Ethiopia where it was originally collected, sometime in the mid-20th century, and sent to research stations in Kenya and Costa Rica, before eventually arriving in Panama, prized at the time not for its flavor, but simply for its resistance to coffee leaf rust, the same disease still circulating globally more than 100 years after it wiped out Ceylon, that made a rust-resistant variety worth planting at all. It was brought to Central America purely as agricultural research material, and in Panama it ended up planted mostly as a windbreak, a hardy border crop, not a product anyone expected to sell. For decades it sat there, unremarkable and mostly ignored, on a family farm called Hacienda La Esmeralda in the highlands near Boquete. Then, during an especially wet, disease-prone growing season, the Peterson family, who ran the farm, noticed one section of their coffee plants staying conspicuously healthy, while everything around it struggled. They isolated those plants, traced them back to the old geisha windbreak, and entered a separate lot of it into the 2004 Best of Panama competition, out of curiosity more than ambition. The judges who tasted it were stunned. It didn't taste like coffee was supposed to taste, floral, almost like jasmine tea, with none of the heavy roasted bitterness they were used to judging. That lot sold at auction for $21 a pound, a record at the time, and roughly 10 times the going rate for excellent coffee. It didn't stop there. By 2019, the same farm's geisha was fetching over $1,000 a pound. In 2025, a single lot of Hacienda La Esmeralda's washed geisha sold at auction for just over $30,000 per kilogram. Bought by a buyer in Dubai, the highest price ever recorded for coffee at that competition's history. A bean that began as an accidental windbreak, descended from a plant collected in the same country the whole industry claims as its birthplace, is now the most expensive coffee most people will never taste. The Greek renaming from Chapter 3 wasn't the end of that argument. It was the opening move in one that's still going. In 2013, at a UNESCO committee session in Baku, delegates from 116 countries formally inscribed Turkish coffee culture and tradition onto the representative list of the intangible cultural heritage of humanity, recognizing not the bean itself, but the specific brewing method, the Civet, and the social rituals built around serving it. From engagement ceremonies to a tradition of reading fortunes in the leftover grounds. For Turkey, it was a formal, UN-backed claim to a drink whose name half the region insists isn't Turkey's alone to hold. Bosnia has since pursued its own heritage recognition for Bosnian coffee under its own name, and similar arguments simmer quietly in Armenia and across the Caucasus, each one following the same basic shape. Identical preparation, different flag attached to it. The Turkish listing didn't settle anything. It's the same coffee served in Sarajevo, Yerevan, Nicosia and Athens, under 4 different national names, each one a small act of political self-definition, dressed up as a beverage order, and each government perfectly happy to let the argument keep running, because the coffee itself was never really what was being fought over. After all the wars, monopolies, and forged national identities, there's a more basic question this entire history has quietly assumed the answer to. Is any of this actually good for the people drinking it? For most of coffee's history, the honest answer was that nobody really knew. And the drink was banned, taxed, and moralized against by people working from guesses, not evidence. In the 1600s and 1700s, it was blamed at various points for impotence, sterility, and drying up the fluid around the brain. Claims with no scientific basis whatsoever, offered with exactly the same confidence as the people who claimed it cured plague. Modern research has finally started replacing those guesses with numbers. One of the largest studies on the subject, published in 2022 by researchers at Queen Mary University of London and Semmelweis University in Budapest, tracked more than 468,000 participants in the UK Biobank and found that drinking up to 3 cups of coffee a day was associated with a measurably lower risk of death from any cause, along with a lower risk of stroke and cardiovascular disease. The protective effect showed up clearly for ground coffee, but not for instant. The exact industrial shortcut that made coffee cheap and universal in the first place seems, on the current evidence, to not carry quite the same benefit as the version it was designed to replace. None of this makes coffee medicine, and researchers are still working out how much of the association is caused by coffee itself versus the habits of the people who drink it. But after 5 centuries of confident, evidence-free claims in both directions, it's a strange kind of ending. The drink that was banned as poison by sultans and kings alike may turn out to be, cautiously, one of the more defensible daily habits on the planet. Coffee didn't spread because one country wanted to sell it and everyone else wanted to buy it. It spread because Yemen tried to hoard it, the Ottomans tried to ban it, Prussia tried to sniff it out of people's kitchens, Greece tried to rename it, colonial Java tried to withhold it, a fungus tried to wipe it out, and a country that no longer exists spent a decade building an industry it would never fully collect on. Even the attempts to fix coffee's problems ended up tangled in the same history, a fair trade movement that borrowed its name from a novel about the very colonial system that produced Kopi Luwak in the first place. Almost none of that history survives in the cup itself. A Turkish coffee doesn't taste like a 1974 war. A Vietnamese Robusta doesn't taste like the Berlin Wall. A $30,000 kilo of Panamanian geisha doesn't taste like the Ethiopian hillside its ancestors came from. But it's all still in there, the same way it's in every other food this channel has covered. The empires, the smugglers, the sniffers, the civets, the composers, and the countries that don't exist anymore. All still sitting quietly underneath whatever's in the cup in front of you right now. The difference is usually just whether anyone's bothered to dig far enough to find it. If you didn't see that coming, hit subscribe. There's more forgotten history where that came from.